James Gunn is trying to be the face of his own DC universe, and he's not off to a bad start with it, with Superman making $550 million so far, but there is a big question about his ego, and a bigger question being, is he a narcissist or not? For James Gunn's history, he was a writer before he was a director, with his first movie ever being Romeo and Juliet, which he wrote and had a budget of only $350,000, and it didn't do so well. And James Gunn in the late 90s stayed with the company that made Romeo, not having that much success as a writer, and he didn't have his big break until the early 2000s with Mike Myers. That was because in the early 2000s, Mike Myers was actually cast to play Shaggy in a live-action Scooby-Doo movie and also write it, but he ultimately had to drop out of it because he was too busy with the Austin Powers franchise. So they ended up hiring James Gunn to direct Scooby-Doo, which was his big break, but he didn't actually get the product he wanted because when he originally wrote the script, it was meant as a rated R movie. The Warner Brothers' logic being they wanted to do to Scooby-Doo what Paramount did with the Brady Bunch, where in 1995 they released the Brady Bunch movie, which was a PG-13 satire, which was a hit, making $52 million on a budget of $12 million. That was actually the movie they made where the first cut of Scooby-Doo was rated R with a lot of cleavage, gore, and also pot jokes throughout the entire movie. But the problem was in the late 90s, early 2000s, Scooby-Doo did have a resurgence with Zombie Island, where it was reported they did $200 million in VHS sales when Warner realized it was still popular with kids. So they ended up changing the movie in post-production to have it be more kid-friendly, completely changing James Gunn's script, which he did view as a betrayal at the time. Still, it was enough of a hit, making $276 million on a budget of $85 million, so James Gunn was happy with the clout and it boosted up his career so he can get other work. James Gunn made another Scooby-Doo movie, and then after that tried to branch into directing, doing his first movie in 2006 called Slither, which was a failure, making only $12 million on a budget of $15 million. And then after that, his next movie was also a failure, which was a film called Super, that's actually technically James Gunn's first ever superhero movie, but it was a huge flop, making only $596,000 on a budget of $2.5 million. James Gunn at the time was really a Hollywood nobody until 2014 when he got picked up for Guardians of the Galaxy. And the reason James Gunn got hired for that, even though he wasn't that big of a name at the time, was because he had a really good pitch for how to handle the character of Rocket Raccoon. And Marvel and Disney saw it as similar to how he handled the character of Scrappy-Doo as well as Scooby-Doo for the Scooby-Doo movie, so it was the reason he ultimately got hired to direct Guardians of the Galaxy. And that was James Gunn's ticket to fame in Hollywood, where it was a huge success with Guardians of the Galaxy, making $773 million on a budget of $230 million. And the reason James Gunn became a hero to Marvel for doing that was that movie came out in 2014, where the only other movie was Captain America Winter Soldier, which made $714 million, so there was this much bigger, more established character than the Guardians, but James Gunn actually won that war. So after that, everything was going the way of James Gunn, where he was seen as the chosen one to Marvel, until he ran into some issues due to a man named Michael Cernovich, who's a conservative commentator. And James Gunn for years is somebody who recognized himself as left-wing and would engage in the Twitter political wars. So Cernovich decided to do some digging on James Gunn's Twitter, and then found in the late 2000s and early 2010s he'd make a lot of jokes like this, where there were dozens of tweets that James Gunn would make about engaging in activities with younger men, and all of them can be seen right here if you zoom in a little bit closer, but there's some pretty freaky stuff here. This was the worst time ever for that to happen to James Gunn, because it was just revealed Bryan Singer, the director of the X-Men movies, had a scandal in the 90s where he had a bunch of young men shower together who were just teenagers without their parents watching. So James Gunn got the slap, and Disney fired him from directing Guardians of the Galaxy 3. James Gunn fought back on that with Disney, saying it was just part of his shock jock humor and he had no intention of actually acting on any of those thoughts at all. And James Gunn was also defended by Dave Bautista, who was in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, saying he wouldn't come back to star in them unless James Gunn was directing the third one. While Disney wouldn't work with James Gunn, the company that did agree to work with him was Warner Brothers, who already worked with him previously on the Scooby-Doo movies, and they wanted him to come in and direct the Suicide Squad sequel. And Suicide Squad 2016 was a hit financially, making $749 million on a budget of $175 million, but the problem was it got really bad scores with audiences, so Warner was concerned that director and that team wouldn't make a good sequel. And Warner was just in disarray at the time with the DC universe, where it was nothing like they planned trying to compete with Marvel, where their Justice League movie lost $150 million, and at the time every movie they were doing was just losing money. James Gunn's Suicide Squad movie did have to take a lot of changes from the first one, with one big example being no Will Smith, because he had to drop out of the movie because he already agreed on filming King Richard instead. So yeah guys, that never actually would have happened if Will Smith agreed to work with James Gunn. And also the Suicide Squad couldn't bring back the Joker because Jared Leto actually hates James Gunn. And that happened because in 2018, Dylan Sprouse came out saying he couldn't stand Jared Leto because he's some sort of freak who messages every 18-year-old model on Instagram. That led to James Gunn making this tweet right here to Dylan Sprouse, talking about Jared Leto making some pretty bad accusations against him. Still, James Gunn did manage to make his Suicide Squad movie, which was a failure, making only $168 million on a budget of $185 million, but it came out in 2021 during the height of COVID, and it was a dual release on HBO Max, so I really am not going to count that as a failure. It Because it got good reviews, it was enough of a reason for Disney to bring back James Gunn to finish Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which he did direct and it had some success. There was a lot more success than what DC was having, where they invested in movies like Black Adam, The Flash, Blue Beetle, and so many more, and they lost $700 million doing it. So finally, James Gunn was brought in to become the new CEO of DC and lead a reboot where he cast David Cornsett to be Superman, but there is a lot of questions about how he's been marketing this universe in his movies that lead to this whole big question of if James Gunn is some sort of narcissist. Explaining why James Gunn kind of comes off as a narcissist, it comes down to marketing like this right here, where a week before Superman came out, Jeopardy had a section featuring DC, and instead of just calling it the DC Universe or Superman or David Cornsett to promote the actual film, it's the DC Universe with James Gunn really trying to set the stones that he owns this universe, this is his. And then there was also this entrance right here in the third season of Harley Quinn, where he wasn't involved in creating that show at all, but they wrote him in almost like this creative genius or prince. It seems like a big factor to that was James Gunn was canceling every project that he wasn't directly controlling related to the DC Universe, like Superman, Lois, and all the CW shows. So it almost felt like the writers were trying to wait on James Gunn hand and foot to really show this is his universe and say, hey, please don't cancel us. There's also the animated series Creature Commandos, which James Gunn was involved in creating for DC, but he does appear in every single episode, but James Gunn said, oh, that wasn't my idea, that was the writers. And let's just face it, that's total BS. That's the same as when Mike Richards, who was the longtime producer for Jeopardy, hired himself to be the host of Jeopardy, and then was going on social media like, oh, I'm so honored, I can't believe it, they're making me the host, I'm so happy. And reality is they found out that he just made the decision to make himself the host of the show, and then he got fired a day later. And then also there's just the marketing for Superman in general, for how James Gunn markets this, where he was on the cover of Rolling Stone, which is kind of weird if you think about it, because James Gunn really wasn't presenting himself like, oh, let's bring out David Cornsett, let's bring out the actress playing Lois Lane, let's bring out the cast. Instead, it was just him trying to really present himself as, this is me, I am the face of this. And most people at the end of the day really don't go for the director, they go for the actors or the title, especially with something like Superman. And then there's also just some signs of narcissism the way he does interviews, and this was actually pointed out to me by my friend Dave Perez at Movie Talk Now, where he mentioned that James Gunn says the word I a lot in interviews, which is actually some sort of way to present the idea someone's a narcissist, because they just go I, just always making it about them. And originally making this video, I was actually prepared to just go out and call out James Gunn saying, oh yeah, this guy's a narcissist, his movies aren't that good, Superman didn't even perform that well at the box office, until I learned one thing, and that's that he was actually married to Jenna Fisher from The Office, and the two did get divorced. And the reason I'm actually going to not call him a narcissist is because of this interview she did talking about her divorce to James Gunn.
You're friends, so to speak.
We're legitimate friends. Yeah.
It's just, how?
I remember he said, when we decided to get divorced, he said, we're not going to be able to call the marriage a success, quote unquote, because we're not staying married, but let's have the most successful divorce. Like, how can we have the most successful divorce? What is a successful divorce?
That's ultimately why I changed my opinion here, because while I do think James Gunn is really just a, mediocre director who does over-promote himself, and I think actually costs Superman some money doing so, just seeing how his ex-wife interacts with him in such a caring way and a nice way and supports him does make me ultimately think this is a nice person who's just a little bit nerdy and awkward and getting ahead of himself. So yeah, really looking at it, I do think he made a better Superman movie than what Zack Snyder did, and I think he's on a decent track with his DC universe. Nothing that special, but nothing that bad. And end of the day, I don't think he's a narcissist, but he does have a big ego, but let's face it, so do I. And with that, I'm Charles Sproul. Please subscribe to learn something.